You're listening to Raincoast Radio.
Welcome to Raincoast Radio's first series of Wolves and Women. I'm Chelsea Greer, Director of Raincoast Wolf Conservation Program, and your host for this series of conversations about wolves and the inspiring women who study them. Today, I'm excited to be joined by a leading expert on wolf social behavior, Jane Packard. Jane, would you mind introducing yourself to our listeners?
Chelsea, thank you. It's such a pleasure to speak with you about wolves and women and wolves today. So I am a professor emeritus, associate professor emeritus at Texas A&M University now. So I'm retired, and it's really wonderful to be able to think back to the beginnings of my career and how really it was wolf spirit that got me started, and share with you maybe some tips and things that will help others as they find their journey and their path in their own careers.
Well, we're really excited to have you here and learn from, as you mentioned, it's early in your career that you started studying wolves, and you started studying wolves in the late 70s. Is that right?
That's right. So that was grad school.
Okay. And what led you there? What led you to studying wolves?
Well, actually, it was Eric Seaman who first introduced me to his pack of wolves in an enclosure in the Bavarian forest in Germany. At the time, I was an undergraduate, an intern at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, and I was studying the behavior of a goose family, so a hand-raised goose family. So I was working with Konrad Lorenz, who later went on to earn the Nobel Prize along with two other folks, for ethology. And Eric Seaman stopped by the Institute to talk with Konrad Lorenz. And so we Goose Girls decided that we just had to go see the wolves. And I fell in love with them and just decided, okay, that's what I want to do my grad studies on.
You were studying personality in geese, right? How do you study personality in geese?
Well, personality is basically the different ways that different individuals respond to their environment. And so, it's kind of like a mix between what we call the inborn character, that might be the genes, and how the cocktail of neurotransmitters and hormones are regulated inside the body. And then also how they respond to others outside. And each responds in a slightly different way. But of course, at that time, that was like undergraduate would look at things like that. Animals don't have personality, but I think that it really was a result of having grown up with dogs in the family. And so, I literally learned dog communication before I learned to talk. And that was one of the things that Konrad Lorenz said. He said, if you really want to understand the behavior in an animal, there's such a difference between those who've had the intimate knowledge of living with that species compared to those who've only studied the animal in a lab setting. So, he said it was important to find an animal that you love. There's going to be long periods of downtime during behavior studies when things seem to be boring, but your passion will carry you through.
Because your focus was so much on animal behavior, I don't know if many of our listeners might be familiar with how someone studies animal behavior. Would you be able to explain that a little bit?
So the essence of it is understanding something that in human pop psychology, we talk about triggers. So what is it that the animal is responding to? In the vocabulary of animal behavior, we just call it the stimulus. And so we're always looking for stimulus response and what changes that probability. So it's all a matter of really understanding the stimulus response, what increases it, what decreases it, analyzing that in terms of positive and negative reinforcement, and then how that changes with the context in the environment and also with the internal physiology of the individuals.
And then you use something called an ethogram when you're in the field studying these. What is an ethogram?
An ethogram is like the dictionary of the behavior of a particular species. So all those actions that you see them do. So, for example, when I was studying the wolves in the captive packs as a graduate student, I had, a list of all the behaviors and a little code for it. And I could just write down, you know, um, 58 over the muzzle, OMB over the muzzle bite, 63. And so that's a way of being able to record it and go back and analyze it. And so the part that is more intuitive is how do you cluster these behaviors together? Because there's a lot of different words in an ethogram. I mean, in a dictionary, but it's the sentences of how they're combined, which is really, what's interesting. And so, yes, that's where I think the different dimensions of behavior, and I tried to tie those dimensions into underlying understanding of the physiology. So, the dimension of fight versus flight being related to the adrenal system, the dimension of caregiving or not being related to the serotonin system. So that's where I think there gets to be a little bit more controversy or discussion. How do you interpret those behaviors? And I think that's still fully open for discussion. But the point is that if you record, systematically just the behavior as your unit of analysis, you can go back and you can analyze it in different ways later on.
And the context is so important as well, right? Because you could have one behavior that means something completely different in a different context.
Exactly, exactly. One of the examples of that is after a conflict interaction, individuals will come back and will, try to make peace, essentially. There's a specific word for that which we use, which is looked at very much in the primate literature and has also been examined for wolves. And so those would be behaviors that would be in a very different context. Yeah.
And you studied wild wolves on Ellesmere Island. What was that experience like?
Ellesmere Island is a jumping off point for the North Pole in the Canadian Arctic. And so I was very, very fortunate to help Dave Meach out during one summer there and to study the wolf pack that he had habituated. So anybody who hasn't read his book of Arctic Wolves, I really encourage you to read that because that was the first opportunity where we really could watch the wolves intimately in the wild because they were not afraid of people. When you think about it, that's tremendous. So there was just a weather station on the island, and the wolves had come into the dump at the weather station, and Dave was called in. It's like, whoa, here's this great opportunity to really watch the wolves. So that was kind of the peak of my dream of studying wolves was to live with a pack in the wild for a summer. After that experience, basically, when I get back to my faculty position, it was the main thought in my mind was, okay, now I've lived my dream. I want to help other students live their dreams. So that was a very pivotal experience.
Is there a story from your time on Ellesmere Island that stands out to you?
I think this is kind of one of those stories about how it takes a village to raise a family. And so mom as working mother, she kept really focused on the situation at hand. And so, for example, there was one time when the pups and mom were at the rendezvous site. The pups had nursed. She broke off and trotted off, and they followed. And she trotted right back towards the den. But she didn't notice that there was this really steep incline. And two of the pups struggled up to the top, but the others just like kind of tumbled down to the bottom of the incline. And the pups that had made it to the top looked down there and said, oh, well, there's the rest of the group. Okay. And they went down and ended up falling asleep. They huddled together and fell asleep. So Grayback, he came back and laid down with the pups. He didn't follow mom. Whitey, who was, either their sister or an auntie, she followed mom. And after a while, mom came back with Whitey looking up to her chin kind of. And I always kind of wondered, did Whitey go and kind of interact with mom, in an anthropomorphic sense, saying, hey, your pups aren't with you. But anyway, the two females came back. Mom just matter-of-factly, came down the incline, interacted with the pups, trotted back up the incline. Pups all trotted up after her, and everybody followed her back to the den. And so that kind of sticks in my mind as a time where it really was the whole family that were watching out over those pups. And pups are kind of like the glue of the family. It's like everybody loves, they just find pups fascinating. And so, that's what builds, I think, the social cohesion in any group is just finding what gives you fascination and joy. I mean, there was another time when Grayback followed the pups over to this little icy patch of snow that the pups really hadn't, they had been playing on a heather meadow. They hadn't been on snow before. And they walked out real tentatively onto this icy patch, and Grayback, was watching them. And then he pounced at them, just like a mouse pouch, which is like a really instinctive behavior in most canids. And those pups went sliding across the ice. And they kind of, got up, shook themselves, wriggled a little bit, came back to Grayback, and he pounced on him again. And so those kind of interactions, are just the kind of the glimpses that you only see momentarily, but they're the magic moments, whether it's watching the wolves or whether it's working with the people that you're working with to care for the wolves. And being able to retain in memory those magic moments is what really gets us through the day.
Yeah, it's such a good example of the behaviors that create that social cohesion and bonding between family members as well. Yeah. And again, like this was early in your career and you're kind of coming back to remembering all these stories. And I can just hear in your voice, like the passion and the fond memories. Like I feel like those stories just stick in your mind forever. And so it's great to hear them. You mentioned Whitey. If you could talk about who Whitey is, was Whitey a female or a male?
It was a female. Yeah. One of the criticisms of giving names to individuals is because then our pre-associations with those names may influence how we're seeing them. And we need to keep an open mind to see the world, from their perspective, not from what we lay on them. And so while watching the wolves on Ellesmere Island, I tried to be careful about giving them names based on their physical characteristics. So Whitey and Grayback were adult wolves that were in the family group with the breeder. In my notes, I called her Nipples because those were her defining characteristics. But, it's now like, okay, I think maybe I'll call her Mom. And then the male, and so he had more of a gray neck. So it looked to us like the breeders were Mom. And, I suppose Dave probably called him alpha male. So we may have called him alpha male. But he never showed any aggression towards any of the individuals of the family group. Oh, I'll tell you this one story because it kind of sticks out in my mind. He had come back from hunting and was laying on the meadow and just resting, sleeping a bit. And the pups had been playing. I mean, they had been playing for hours. So chase games, jaw wrestling, and they kind of paused and laid down a little bit. And then one of them looked over at alpha male and then looked at the back at the rest of the pups and kind of wheeled his tail a little bit. And the pups got up and kind of like creeped over towards alpha male, their little butts wiggling. And when they got within range, of course, he raised his head and they came over and they licked up to him, up to his chin, which, usually if he had come back with food, he would have regurgitated for them. But no. And each time a pup came within 6 inches of his muzzle, he did an over the muzzle bite, which, if you know dog language, is not, it's subduing, but not really aggressive at all. And so after a while, those pups were jumping up and down within 6 inches of his muzzle and not touching him. And he just stayed there calmly as they came over and like crawled over his back and pulled off the hair that was molting. And that was the essence of the relationship between the food provider and the pups. And that's a very different relationship than, what we might associate with the term alpha male.
Yeah, and in the early 2000s, you were internationally recognized as a leading expert on wolf social behavior for this research that you conducted early in your career. Who was your inspiration when it came to understanding animal behavior?
Jane Goodall. She was my inspiration to become an ethologist because she basically introduced us to the language of chimpanzees by living amongst them. And she's also inspired us to take that next step and to learn to see the world through the eyes of another being. So whether it's two-legged or four-legged. And this, of course, I think it also applies to understanding the worldviews of people who have diverse experiences. It's so important for resolving some of the issues in human animal conflict or understanding how well-being of animals in captivity or in the wild. It really involves crossing from the human world into the animal world and back again. We always have to keep tracking, keep very much aware when we're thinking about well-being, not to project our own ideas onto that dog that you know so well, but to gain insights and to try to see the world from the perspective of your dog, not just your projections onto your dog.
And I think that speaks a lot to also how much science has evolved and how much we can understand animals so much more by understanding how they perceive the world. And I mean, I think about you studying wolves back in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And, you're saying it was generally unacceptable to even think that geese had personalities. I mean, when you were studying wolves starting in the 70s and then, started talking and writing about social intelligence in the early 2000s, when was it really that you started to think about intelligence in wolves during that work? Because I imagine that's not really something that a lot of scientists had written about at the time or even really thought about back then.
Yeah, that's very much true because, particularly a lot of the work that we were following at that time was from Dave Meach, and his key questions were about wolf as predator. And of course, that was related to his position with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But I think it was Jane Goodall, Jane Goodall's book, In the Shadow of Man, it's what really opened my eyes to what I wanted to focus on as an undergraduate in college. And so I was at a liberal arts college, Swarthmore College, where I could literally combine courses from different departments. So I included anthropology because that's where the primate studies were, and I wanted to learn more about, the context of what Jane Goodall was writing about. But also biology, I wanted to understand more about the physiology of what was going on inside, and psychology, getting at the, developmental aspects of behavior. So that was a set of formative, set of experiences as an undergraduate that was very, very different from the people who were studying wolves as predators.
And staying on this topic of social intelligence, you've written articles and chapters on wolf reproduction and social intelligence and complexity of these animals. And there was one chapter that you were asked to write for a particular book and it ended up not being accepted. Can you talk a bit about that process?
The book was about social intelligence in primates. And actually, it's kind of a funny story because Mark Bekoff had been invited to write the chapter for that book because he had the connections with Jane Goodall, and he declined because from his studies of behavior of coyotes, he basically said, "Well, we don't have the equivalent of social intelligence. We don't have any scientific studies of that." And so I thought it would be kind of fun to go to that conference in England, and so I said, "Sure, I'll do it." And what I tried to be really careful about was that it's not so much social intelligence in wolves, but it is their inherent intelligence that's shaped by the social context of growing up in a family group. And that was a little bit too far from the mainstream of that book. And so the chapter was dropped, and which actually gave me more freedom to really kind of put my ideas together in the basic question that I'd been struggling with since grad school. How do we get beyond the early stories, which were, the concepts that basically wolves had to cooperate in order to catch large prey. And in order to maintain that kind of coordination within the family group, there were the dominant ones and there were the subordinate ones, and the subordinates had to serve the dominant. And to me, that was like it was human perspective laid onto the wolves rather than really seeing the wolves for themselves. And so that chapter basically, in academia, we try to put what we study in a broader context. And so there had been some studies of hyenas in comparison with the social intelligence hypothesis for the primates. And that gave, like kind of a clue that because the prevailing hypotheses at that time were, okay, is intelligence because individuals have to maneuver this really complex society in their social group, or is it because of a complex environment? And it's both. So that was basically what I found really interesting in exploring in that paper is that the qualities in the genotype that might result in flexibility and resilience in a changing physical environment also are going to be pre-adaptations for the complexities of a social environment.
And maybe just to back up a little bit and provide some context for some listeners, I wonder, with wolves, we know they live in a complex environment that is ever changing. That includes their social environment and their physical environment. Can you explain what the difference between the social and the physical environment is?
That's a good, good challenge right there. Okay, let's think about the physical environment first, because Dave Meach now is just summarizing his own, decades long set of studies about intrinsic regulation in populations of wolves. And at first, he thought that wolf populations were controlled by the prey. And so I think what has come out of some of the studies, particularly out of like Isle Royal, but Meach covers many more studies, is that as long as there's kind of a stable period in a given ecosystem, that the prey availability may influence the resources available to the wolves. But when there is some disturbance and we see that relative stability be disrupted and change and then get reorganized into a new period of stability, that's the whole idea of how natural dynamics are really cycles. They're not all just like one progression to a stable state that's going to, be consistent for a while. And so the disturbances that we see in the environment of wolves, I mean, actually, I was really, impressed living with wolves on Ellesmere Island at the glacial cycles that this species gone through really through, like 250,000 years, pushing the species south with glacial expansion, pulling back up. And so that kind of dynamics really influences us to see that wolves are adapted to varying conditions of prey being available, not being available. When prey are not available, youngsters tend to stay within the family group if there's not small prey available outside and they can disperse. And so I kind of think of it as 4 quadrants. So prey high, prey low, wolf density high, wolf density low, and the dynamics of dispersal and remaining in the pack are different under each one of those conditions. And it all changes with cycles of disturbance.
Yeah, that's such a great way to explain how wolves and wolf dynamics interact with the physical environment. You and David Meach also wrote about the intrinsic factors that might influence wolf abundance and wolf populations. Is there more that you can share on those concepts?
Yeah, so the social environment. So that was more the physical environment, the resources available to the working mom. I'm thinking of wolves now more in terms of working moms rather than dominance hierarchy. Yes, so within a wolf population, if you think of what different opportunities there are for working moms when there are open spaces. And so we talk about low population density. There are open spaces, dispersers can leave, they can, maybe survive on small prey, find a mate, establish a new pack of their own. And so in these kind of like new nuclear families, the sense I'm getting is that there's very little conflict because it's youngsters that form the family group with their mother. And there's that relationship that's developed between mom and the youngsters that, persists into adulthood. It's different than when a population is really dense and there is conflict between packs for resources, trespass into a neighboring pack, territory, maybe going after a prey item, and the packs then defend. It's scary. It's scary to see a neighboring wolf that you don't know. And that's when wolves get killed, when you get disruptions within a pack, where that, if one of the breeding members of the family is removed, then you see disruption within the family group in our captive packs, and also in the wolves that have been studied in Yellowstone. You see parent offspring courtship and you see sib-sib courtship. And so you see much more complexity in terms of the relationships and the breeding patterns within a group. So as long as there's enough food available and there's not that kind of high wolf density, then you might be able to see packs grow in size. Some of the examples that we've had that Gordon Haber studied in Alaska, enough food to go around, not a lot of dispersal, not a lot of conflict or change in the breeding pair. And you'll see a much, much different dynamics than in the other conditions.
Yeah, so it seems kind of like this complex interaction between both extrinsic and intrinsic factors when it comes to wolf abundance and populations. Did you study wolves in Yellowstone as well?
Yes, we did. And so that was Linda Thurston's study. And so she followed 4 packs at separate dens. And we were at a distance, so we couldn't really see the details of the interactions quite as much. And the wolves were radio collared. And so she was interested basically in who fed the pups. Was it mom or dad? And she found that it was pretty much equally mom and dad. Of course, in the first, 3 to 4 weeks, mom was in the den with the pups. And so dad was feeding mom. But then once mom came out, then both mom and dad were feeding the pups about the same. I guess one of the things that I found interesting in that study, one of the dens that we watched was actually the first time that I'll call her daughter, had bred, and her mom had denned across the valley. And so this was a situation where the mom had lost her mate, accepted a new male, and that male mated with 2 of the daughters. And the one that we were watching, that breeding male and the wolf's brother came over and attended her as well as the mom's litter. But she had a sister who denned further away on the border of another pack. The males did not attend the sister's den, and she and her pups were killed by the neighboring pack. So, there was those kind of experiences that got me thinking more of wolf as working mom than wolf as alpha female.
What is a nuclear family?
A nuclear family is the way that we think about monogamy, even in humans. So it's mom and dad and their offspring. Now, the thing that is different about a wolf pack is that half of the offspring from one litter will disperse by the end of the first year. And of those who stick around and help care for the next year's litter, half of them will disperse by the 3rd year. So it's a little bit different than human nuclear families because you've got a litter, not just kids of different ages.
And before your work on Ellesmere Island, you were studying wolves at a captive facility in Minnesota for your PhD. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
That's right. We called it Carlos Avery. And so, that was kind of the transition from the internship at the Max Planck Institute to the University of Minnesota. So one of the things I want to, share with some of your listeners is who are just getting started in their careers is the importance of taking internships, get as much experience as you can, because when that internship in the Max Planck Institute, that was a follow-up on an internship that I did with Eric Klinghammer, Purdue University, and he later started Wolf Park there. And so it was Eric Zeman, Eric Klinghammer introduced me to Dave Meach at the conference on wolf behavior. And that was how then Dave was looking for someone to do the behavior for a study that he and Yuli Seal wanted to do, looking at whether wolves were physiologically suppressed, because that obviously would have been important in terms of understanding control of wolf populations. So I was basically in the position of being between the two worlds on that research team, Dave Meach being the field biologist in the world of ecology, and Yuli Seal being the biomedical researcher and very interested in the physiology of what was going on inside the wolves. And so behavior is at the interface of those two worlds.
Getting the opportunity to study both wolves in captivity and in the wild, how did those two interact? How did they inform one another? And I guess what are the limitations as well?
We were certainly able to follow the details year round and to understand how the changes in physiology throughout the seasons changes, and then also how the changes in physiology change during the maturation process, how in the different life stages of the individuals. And that was a perspective that we certainly could not have gotten from the wild. And at the same time, though, there were a lot of constraints that we didn't quite understand at the time, but later became important, because the captive wolves, there's not a mechanism for dispersal. And that is really, really huge in the experience of wild wolves. The other thing that's really, really different is that there's not that function of individuals bringing back food to the pups, because those positive rewards are what build the coherence of the relationships within a family group. Downtown, I watch people with their pocket on their belt with the little doggy treats, and they're trying to teach their pup, to heel. And so they keep feeding them, little treats out of the bag. And it's like, oh yeah, well, that's what the wolves are naturally doing, because each time a member of the family brings back food and regurgitates to the pups, the pups are running along with that individual. The relationship between the mom and the pups is so important, because in about the 10th week, she will more often interrupt nursing bouts. And so she runs along, and then the pups run along behind her. So, she's basically teaching them to heel. And as a cohesive family group, then they go with the parents, other pack members, and get to experience in a social context hunting. So that's, I guess, getting at your question of, well, what really is social intelligence? It's not so much the intelligence of how to get along in a social group, but the intelligence of getting your food and your resources in the context that is provided by other members of your social group.
Yeah, and this makes me think about the individuals that make up the pack, and how wolves are often, especially in wildlife management or traditional conservation paradigms, they're often viewed as numbers that make up a population. What would you say your work has taught you about the importance of individuals and understanding individuals?
Aha. So actually, the importance is moving from what I call mouse vision to eagle vision and back again. So understanding the individual in the context of the population, and the population in the context of the individuals. Well, it also gets to what Mark Bekoff talks about as compassionate conservation, So any of the management actions that might be considered, it's also important to think about what are the ethics of that for the individual, but also not to get too caught up in, saving every single individual, because that may not be beneficial in the long term for the population as a whole. So, I mean, it's this tension that we have as humans too. What I need for myself versus the benefit of the the society in which I live.
Yeah. And there's been some really innovative strategies that really take into consideration both the individual and the population, which I mean, I think really demonstrates the importance of opening up this kind of dialogue between animal welfare scientists and conservation biologists. Now, I'd love to talk to you about this sort of transition that has happened over time from wolves being seen as a dominance hierarchy to now viewing them as families or family units. How do you think this changed how we understand wolves and wolf behavior?
I think the shifts have been in the sense of understanding variation amongst individuals and how that fits within the context of the social groups. So the dominance hierarchy, definitely you see a clear-cut dominance hierarchy in a group of wolf pups that have been separated from parents and raised in a captive setting without the influence of parents. But that's a very artificial kind of situation. And so we can talk about the equality or I want to say kind of imbalance of relationships. So I think that was what Eric Seaman really showed us in his pack, is that a relationship can be very stable for a while. And then if something changes in terms of the right resources within the social environment, like availability of a mate or not, that relationship can just like switch on a dime and it can become very antagonistic. And so I really encourage people to be thinking not in terms of a dominance hierarchy, but rather the relative assertiveness and, let's see, humility actually is what I used. That being a certain dimension. You're bringing me back to studies that we did of wolves in the Houston Zoo. So looking at the different dimensions of personality. And so one of those being assertiveness versus humility. And you can see that in the wolves. I mean, assertive, it's really easy because the ears are really up and pointed, and humility is the ears back and flat to the head. And so I've been criticized about saying that's humility, but maybe humbleness is another way of saying it. I just wanted to get away from the words of dominance and subordinates.
Yeah, because that makes me think about, because I've had this conversation with Paul Paquette often around, I mean, even these terms used alpha pair, alpha female, breeding pair, dominant pair. And I mean, one of the reasons it seems like, everyone has their reasons for using them or not using them. And I mean, one reason to not use them is because, I mean, when we put animals into a certain pocket or a certain term, it kind of a rigid term, it doesn't necessarily reflect how dynamic they are. And then this use of the term dominant kind of implies that to be that alpha, to be that breeding pair, you have to display this like more assertiveness and dominant behavior. When in reality, I mean, Paul, and I'm sure you have seen with some individuals, they kind of just quietly demand respect. And that kind of shows, the differences in individuals as well. And that makes me think of Rick McIntyre's book on, I mean, on so many different wolves, but on alpha females and how you have one pack that might be led by a quite violent, aggressive female. And then you have one pack that might display this level of cooperation, care, and patience and nonviolence. And it's just so interesting to see those differences and even how it builds culture within different wolf packs.
Exactly. Yeah. And I guess hearing you talk also makes me realize like the key thing was that when we were watching those wolves at Ellesmere, we saw no antagonistic interactions within the family group. I did see one where Whitey chased a strange wolf that had wandered into the area. Like in my mind, when I'm hearing these differences between individuals, I'm also thinking of the cocktail in the brain. And so, they're the hormonal changes. And so you're going to see the difference in interactions and relationships related to the breeding cycle. But also individuals have a different set point in their brain, like, pardon me, but I go into, serotonin. So we know of serotonin as the neurotransmitter that's related to getting positive strokes. And so where you see a family group where there's a lot of rallying and looking up to the nose and, social grooming and that kind of thing, you would expect there to be a very different, level of serotonin. And we know of serotonin is as the neurotransmitter of well-being, that when it's low, the other systems like the norepinephrine, the adrenal system, can go fight or flight. But it's when serotonin's high, when you're getting a lot of positive strokes, then that kind of, blankets it. And instead of going fight or flight, you're able to assess the situation and, bring into the behavior the learned experience of what are likely to be the consequences of a given response.
It makes me think about something that I read in one of your chapters about all these people coming in from different backgrounds and perspectives studying these wolves. And if you have a background in philosophy or if you have a background in animal welfare, veterinary medicine, like how that kind of informs the questions that you ask. And I think it really is a good example of why collaboration is really important, and collaborating with folks from different fields and not just kind of sticking within one pocket of discipline too. It kind of expands our understanding of the animals, or allows us to expand. Because I mean, they're not in this particular pocket, and we really have to understand, I think, to really understand their behavior and how they perceive the world, we have to understand all these different senses and kind of get out of that human-centric approach as well.
And I think that's also important as far as interacting with the other folks in managing wolf populations. So the human animal conflict, really understanding from the perspective of folks who've had very different backgrounds, whether it be ranchers who are protecting the livelihood of their livestock, or the conservationists who, recognize that unless there is some regulation of a particular area, we're going to lose the natural cycles in that area. So that's actually where I had the fortune to branch out, not only in looking at the different perspectives in the care of the wolves, but also collaborating with environmental anthropologists who have more of the knowledge of how to understand the different worldviews of the people whose lives are influenced by wolf conservation. So that led to a series of really interesting studies also. So Jose Bernal Dupin was interested in the collaboration in return of the Mexican wolf to the wild. And so we interviewed 20 people on the Mexican side of the border and 20 people on the US side of the border. And we're sure to kind of balance it in terms of four groups, four types of perspectives. So the ranchers, the governmental regulators, the conservation groups, and then the captive breeders. And it was really fascinating to find that actually there was very little difference across the border. The differences were really more between those who were making a livelihood in the rural environment compared to those making a livelihood in the urban environment. So being able to keep one's mind open to hearing those different perspectives and really, diving deep into those conversations of understanding the worldview and then bringing them together in the safe space where they can hear each other's perspectives. I think the key for conservation of wolves is going to be in each particular location. What are your goals for protecting the wildlands and the wildlife? And, encourage people who have different perspectives to identify their options to the solutions and to understand each other's perspectives on those options. Because by doing so, each may reframe how it is that they see the problem. And that appears to me now to be a positive way of moving forward in terms of resolving some of these in a very site-specific group of, I call them stakeholders. Some people don't like that word, but people who have a stake in what kind of management actions or what kind of problems need to be resolved. And also to engage those people not only in one process, but in what we call an adaptive management, which is a positive problem solving process where, as a group, you pick one management action that you think is going to help get you closer to the goal, the conservation goal. It might not be perfect, not everybody might like it, but you agree to collect information to decide whether it really did get you closer to that goal. Then you meet again at the end of a year and you decide, did that work or did it work? And then make the next set of decisions. So that perspective actually came to me from participating in conservation biology. So in that Society for Conservation Biology. And that's another thing that I would really encourage folks listening to this conversation to be active in your professional societies, and particularly in groups like conservation biology, where it's bringing together biological perspectives and the people perspectives.
Do you have any advice to young girls and women who are interested in pursuing a career in wildlife science or animal behavior?
I think one of the most important things goes along with seeing Wolf as spirit guide between worlds. Wolf as a spirit guide is drawing from the worldview of indigenous peoples, and I can't be specific as to which tribes, but I became very interested in this when we were looking at how people, responded to wolves, and became very clear during the period of the wolf reintroduction in Yellowstone that people were influenced by the symbolism. And much of the symbolism comes from the wolf at the door, from Little Red Riding Hood, from some of the stories out of Europe. And I became much more interested just because on a personal level, I relate more to indigenous peoples. I became more interested in what are the stories of wolves within what we are allowed to read from indigenous perspectives. And so that's where I picked up on wolf as messenger between worlds. And it's more kind of in the context of between the living and the non-living world. So entry from the physical world into the spiritual world. But I found that analogy worked for me in many different ways, not just picking it up and appropriating it from those other cultures. But when you think about it as wolf spirit, leading us into situations where we find things that we might not otherwise have discovered. And that, I think, I've had a number of people contact me and say, "Oh, I want to study wolves." And I'll just kind of say, well, by wanting to study wolves, you may be led into a situation where you'll find that there is an opening just waiting for you to explore. So, that's a sense of it being wolf spirit, that it takes us to explore those different opportunities, not only between this world and the other world, but in this world, there'll be doors that close, and wolf spirit can lead us to other doors that open. So at one point, I kind of wanted to be the Jane Goodall of wolves, but that wasn't going to happen, because if we have a role model, that person's trajectory in life has been very, very distinct based on what was available at the time. And so it's important to remain grounded in knowing what is available, who are the people around you, and what are your options to move forward. When I was a grad student, I was open-minded to take a short-term job studying sea otters. And that was looking at some of the conflict related to the risk of oil spills for sea otters, and then also conflict with fishermen. And so that provided me with a network, and then also another application of the skills of being able to look at different perspectives that led to a postdoc in Florida looking at some of the issues with manatees in terms of conflict between humans and manatees. And so, those kind of skills and the willingness to pivot and enter into another world, whereas, basically what allowed me to get that job at Texas A&M University.
Yeah, that definitely resonates a lot with me too. I feel like not having like a set, like this is what I'm going to do, but kind of allowing like your experiences, whether it's in internships and grad school, undergrad, just your personal life kind of guide you to where you are. And I feel like that's kind of what got me to Raincoast and Wolves too. So I really resonate with that.
Another word of advice here, and I learned this actually from being in Mexico, it's the importance of integrating head and heart. So head is like our analytical process of, is this reality? And then heart is the subconscious, the intuitive, the ability to synthesize information and pull it together and have a gut feeling. And we can get into trouble if we just go with a gut feeling. We also can get into trouble if we're just in our head all the time. And so it's being able to integrate head and heart, which I think are really important as a lesson learned from the wolves.
Yeah. And I think that all very well said really highlights the tie of like the fate of large carnivores in Canada, the US, worldwide is, I mean, it's so important to understand biology, but in so many aspects, it's more closely tied to sociology and really having those conversations. I think what you highlighted is the importance of communication. I think wolves can get people quite emotional and can be quite a contentious topic for some. And I think it's really important for us to continue talking to people with different perspectives and listening. We don't always have to sympathize, but I think empathy is extremely important, and trying to put ourselves in the shoes of others that are having different experiences and kind of collectively come to some sort of resolve or strategy that's going to not only boost tolerance of these species like wolves, but hopefully move more towards acceptance and, living alongside them peacefully.
Exactly. Living with wildlife as neighbors, particularly in an environment that's becoming more and more impacted by human activities. But I guess I feel good about the future of wolves and other wildlife because of the words of Robin Wall Kimmerer. She wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, and anybody who hasn't read it, I really encourage you to do it. But she says that we have hope as long as the land endures and we cultivate people who have the humility and the ability to listen and learn.
Well, thank you. It was so amazing to have you on, Jane. It was just such a pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you, Chelsea. It's been a real pleasure for me also.
Well, thank you all so much for listening. Tune in next time to hear more conversations about wolves and the inspiring women who study them. I want to acknowledge that this episode was hosted and recorded on unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands.
This series is dedicated to Gudrun Pfluger, a passionate field biologist, friend, and source of inspiration to many within Raincoast and beyond. Raincoast Radio is hosted by Chelsea Greer and produced by me, Sophia Osborne, with additional audio editing by Omar Salafu. This podcast is a production of Raincoast Conservation Foundation, a team of conservationists and scientists empowered by research to protect the lands, waters, and wildlife of coastal British Columbia. Learn more and support our work at raincoast.org.